Right now, as you are watching this video, Europe is bleeding money. Not because of a recession, not because of bad policy, but because two countries on the other side of the world decided to drop bombs on a third one. And somehow, the people paying the highest price for this war are not in Tehran, not in Washington, and not in Tel Aviv. They are in Berlin, Paris, Rome, and London. This is the story of how the Iran war is quietly bankrupting Europe and why almost nobody is talking about it. Welcome back to Professor Ashford. If this is your first time here, this is the channel where we follow the money behind the wars, the empires, and the power plays that shape our world. And today, the money trail leads straight from the burning skies over Iran to the gas bills landing on the doorsteps of 450 million Europeans. Let us set the scene. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint military strike on Iran. This was not a limited operation. This was regime change. Airstrikes hit Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, and military sites across the country. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader was dead. The operation had a code name. The Americans called it Operation Epic Fury, and within days, the fury spread far beyond Iran's borders. Iran retaliated the way everyone feared it would. Missiles and drones were launched at American military bases across the Gulf. Bahrain was hit. Kuwait was hit. Qatar was hit. The UAE was hit. Airports closed across the region. Emirates Airlines grounded its fleet. Flights were canceled by the thousands. And then came the real weapon, not a missile, not a drone, a waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you have watched this channel before, you know that every war has a financial choke point. A place where money, trade, and power all converge into a single bottleneck. In the age of the British Empire, it was the Suez Canal. In the Cold War, it was the Berlin Corridor. And today, in 2026, it is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman is only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. But through this tiny passage flows roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply. Every single day, around 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through it. On top of that, about 20% of all global liquefied natural gas trade moves through the same strait. We are talking about the single most important energy corridor on the planet. And within days of the first bombs falling on Tehran, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz ground to a near complete halt. Iran made it clear that any vessel moving through those waters was a potential target. Insurance companies pulled coverage, tanker captains refused to sail. And just like that, 1/5 of the world's oil and gas supply was effectively locked behind a wall of military threats. Now here is where Europe enters the picture. And this is where the story gets painful. You see, Europe already went through an energy crisis. A brutal one. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin weaponized his gas pipelines. He cut supplies to Europe by more than 80%. Gas prices in Europe exploded to nearly 300 euros per megawatt hour, up from around 20 euros just 2 years earlier. Electricity bills doubled and tripled overnight. Factories shut down. Aluminum smelters, fertilizer plants, glass manufacturers, all of them simply could not afford to keep the lights on. European governments spent a staggering amount of money to keep their economies from collapsing. Germany alone poured roughly 158 billion euros into energy relief. France spent around 90 billion. Italy, another 90 billion. Across the European Union, the total fiscal spending to shield consumers and businesses from soaring energy prices reached over 650 billion euros by mid-2023. Some estimates put the total cost, including excess market prices that consumers and businesses absorb directly, at over 1 trillion euros. 1 trillion, that is not a typo. That is the real price Europe paid for depending on Russian energy. And here is the cruel twist. Europe thought it had learned its lesson. After the Russian crisis, European leaders moved fast. They built new LNG terminals. Germany, which had 0 liquefied natural gas terminals before 2022, suddenly began constructing several. Europe diversified its suppliers. It signed new contracts with the United States, with Norway, with Qatar, with Algeria. By the end of 2024, gas storage facilities across the EU were over 90% full heading into winter. Prices had come back down. The crisis seemed to be over. But the problem was not solved. It was merely relocated. Europe did not stop depending on imported energy. It just changed who it was depending on. And one of the biggest new suppliers it turned to was Qatar, the tiny Gulf state, sitting on one of the largest natural gas reserves in the. Qatar became a lifeline for Europe. And that lifeline just got cut. When Iran retaliated against the American and Israeli strikes, its drones hit Qatari territory. Qatar LNG, the state-owned company and the largest producer of liquefied natural gas on the planet, announced that it was halting all LNG production. The facilities at Ras Laffan and Mesaide Industrial City were shut down. Now satellite imagery later suggested that the physical damage to Ras Laffan may have been limited. But that did not matter. Production stopped. And when Qatar stops producing LNG, the entire global gas market feels it immediately. We are talking about roughly 19% of the world's near-term LNG supply vanishing overnight. The impact on Europe was immediate and devastating. On the Friday before the strikes, the European benchmark gas price at the title transfer facility in the Netherlands was sitting at about €32 per megawatt hour. By Tuesday, it had surged to over €54. At one point during the week, it touched nearly €64. That is a jump of nearly 70% in a matter of days. And this was just the beginning. Now, EU officials were quick to point out that Europe gets most of its LNG from the United States, about 58%, while Qatar only accounts for around 8% of direct EU imports. And technically, that is true. But energy markets do not work in isolation. LNG is a global commodity. When Qatar's supply disappears, the countries that depend on it most, China, South Korea, Japan, and India, are suddenly forced to go shopping for alternatives. And where do they go? They go to the same market that Europe depends on. They start bidding for American LNG, for Norwegian gas, for anything they can get their hands on. And when you have Asia and Europe competing for the same limited supply of gas, prices go in only one direction, up. This is exactly what happened in 22 during the Russian crisis. Europe's desperate scramble for LNG crowded out imports to Latin America and Asia. Now, in 2026, the shoe is on the other foot. Asia is scrambling because of Qatar, and Europe is getting caught in the crossfire of a bidding war it did not start. But the gas story is only half of it. Oil prices also surged. Brent crude, the global benchmark, jumped over 10% in the first days of the conflict, climbing from around $70 to above $80 per barrel. By the end of the first week, it was pushing toward $89. Energy traders were openly warning that $100 oil was coming if the conflict continued. European diesel futures hit their highest level since October 2022. For a continent that imports 58% of its total energy, every single dollar added to the price of oil is a direct tax on the European economy. And the timing could not have been worse. Europe entered 2026 in a fragile state. Gas storage levels were much lower than in previous years. At the end of February, European storage sat at only 46 billion cubic meters, compared to 60 billion the year before and 77 billion in 2024. A cold winter had drained reserves. And now, just as Europe needed to start refilling those reserves for the next winter, the global gas market was being thrown into chaos by a war in the Middle East. The economic damage was showing up everywhere. European stock markets fell sharply in the first week of the conflict. The auto sector, which is enormously energy intensive, dropped over 8%. Chemicals fell more than 6%. Industrials lost nearly 5%. These are not just numbers on a screen. These are factories that might close, workers who might lose their jobs, and products that will cost more to make and more to buy. Economists were already crunching the numbers. Estimates suggested that the Eurozone growth could be reduced by at least 0.1%, with inflation pushed up by roughly half a percentage point. That might sound small, but in an economy the size of Europe's, even small shifts translate into hundreds of billions of euros in lost output and higher costs. And those were the optimistic projections. If the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed for weeks or months, analysts warned of something far worse: stagflation, that terrible combination of a stagnant economy and rising prices, the nightmare scenario that central bankers fear most. The European Central Bank was suddenly facing an impossible choice. Before the war, it had been gradually cutting interest rates to support a fragile economic recovery. Inflation had been coming down nicely, hitting 1.9% in February, just below the 2% target. Everything seemed to be on track. And then the bombs started falling, and suddenly the ECB was staring at the possibility of having to raise rates again, right when the economy needed lower rates most. And here is the deeper structural problem that nobody in Brussels wants to admit. Europe did not actually fix its energy vulnerability after 2022. It patched it. It replaced one set of foreign suppliers with another set of foreign suppliers. It swapped dependence on Russian pipelines for dependence on global LNG markets that are subject to the exact same geopolitical shocks. The pipes changed, but the fundamental weakness remained. Europe still does not produce enough of its own energy. It still imports the majority of what it needs. And every time a conflict erupts in the Middle East, or a dictator decides to weaponize a pipeline, or a strait gets blocked, Europe pays the price. This is not new. If you study the history of European energy, you see this pattern repeating again and again. The 1973 oil embargo, when Arab states cut off oil supplies to punish the West for supporting Israel, triggered a brutal recession across Europe. The 1979 Iranian Revolution, which overthrew the Shah and disrupted Iranian oil exports, sent prices soaring and pushed European economies into another downturn. The 2022 Russian gas crisis, which we just talked about, cost Europe over €1 trillion. And now, in 2026, the Iran war is delivering the fourth major energy shock to hit Europe in just over 50 years. Every single time, the pattern is the same. A geopolitical event erupts in an energy-producing region. Supply gets disrupted. Prices spike. Europe scrambles to find alternatives. Governments spend billions or even trillions to cushion the blow. And then, once the crisis passes, everyone goes back to business as usual until the next time. Meanwhile, look at who benefits from all of this. The United States is now the world's largest oil exporter and the world's largest LNG producer. Every time Middle Eastern energy gets disrupted, demand for American energy goes up. American companies like ExxonMobil and Shinnery are positioned to fill the gap that Qatar left behind. American LNG exports to Europe already doubled between 2021 and 2022 during the Russian crisis. Now with Qatari LNG offline, the same dynamic is playing out again. Europe's crisis is in many ways America's opportunity. And Russia, the country Europe tried so hard to cut off from its energy markets, is also watching this with satisfaction. Higher global oil prices mean more revenue for Moscow, even with sanctions in place. The war that the United States started in Iran is indirectly financing the war that Russia continues to wage in Ukraine. The irony is almost too painful to describe. India, meanwhile, is playing its own game. Just weeks before the Iran war, India signed a trade deal with the United States that included a promise to stop buying Russian oil. But then the Iran crisis hit, energy supplies tightened, and the Trump administration quietly reversed course, temporarily allowing India to buy Russian oil again to keep global markets from spiraling further. India, once again, is playing every side and coming out ahead. So where does this leave Europe? The honest answer is that it leaves Europe in a deeply vulnerable position. The continent that once ruled the world through its empires, that colonized continents and controlled global trade routes, is now at the mercy of energy decisions made in Washington, Moscow, Riyadh, and Doha. Every European factory, every European household, every European economy is connected by an invisible thread to a narrow strait on the other side of the world. And when that thread gets pulled, Europe feels it first and feels it hardest. The numbers tell a devastating story. In 2022, the energy crisis cost Europe over 1 trillion euros. Now, barely 3 years later, Europe is facing the possibility of another shock of similar magnitude. Gas prices have nearly doubled in a week. Oil is heading toward $100. Stock markets are falling. Industrial sectors are bracing for impact. And the European Central Bank may be forced to raise interest rates at the worst possible moment. This is what it looks like when a continent outsources its energy security. This is what happens when you depend on other people's oil, other people's gas, and other people's political stability to keep your lights on and your factories running. Europe is not at war with Iran. Europe did not vote for this conflict. Europe did not launch a single missile. And yet, Europe may end up paying the highest economic price of all. The real question is not whether Europe can survive this crisis. It probably can. It survived 2022. It will find a way to muddle through again. The real question is whether Europe will finally break the cycle. Whether this time, the lesson will actually stick. Whether European leaders will look at this moment and decide that the era of energy dependence must end, not in 2040, not in 2050, but now. Because if history teaches us anything, it is that empires do not collapse from external invasion. They collapse from internal weakness. And for Europe, that weakness has been the same for half a century. Energy, the one resource it needs most and produces least. The one vulnerability that every adversary knows how to exploit. The one problem that keeps coming back, each time more expensive than the last. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you understand the connection between wars, energy, and economics, subscribe to Professor Ashford and turn on notifications so you never miss a class. And if you want to go deeper into how energy has shaped the rise and fall of empires, check out the videos linked on screen right now. Class dismissed.